What if everything you were taught to revere was built upon a foundation that crumbles under the slightest pressure of reason? What if the figure you were instructed to worship, to pray to model your entire existence upon, never walked the earth as described, or perhaps never existed at all? These are not questions designed to offend, but to liberate. They are questions that those who claim authority over your thoughts do not want you to ask. Yet here we stand, at the threshold of inquiry, where doubt becomes not a sin but a virtue, and where the courage to question reveals more truth than 1,000 sermons ever could. For centuries, humanity has been told that faith is the highest form of knowledge, that belief without evidence is somehow noble, that to doubt is to betray both God and community. But consider this. If a truth is genuine, why does it fear examination? If a claim is valid, why must it be protected by threats of eternal punishment for those who dare to investigate it? The moment any doctrine demands that you stop thinking, stop questioning, stop using the very faculty of reason that supposedly distinguishes you from all other creatures, that is the moment you should recognize you are being controlled, not enlightened. The figure known as Jesus Christ occupies a unique position in human consciousness. Billions structure their lives around teachings attributed to him. Wars have been fought in his name. Laws have been written according to interpretations of his supposed words. Entire civilizations have organized themselves around the claim that this man was not merely human, but divine, not merely a teacher, but the literal son of a cosmic creator. Yet when we apply the same standards of evidence and logical scrutiny that we use for any other historical claim, when we examine the foundations of this narrative with the dispassionate eye of reason rather than the clouded vision of inherited belief, a disturbing picture emerges. Not disturbing because it threatens faith, but disturbing because it reveals how easily human beings can be convinced to accept as absolute truth that which has no solid ground beneath it. This is not an attack on those who believe. This is an invitation to those who think. There is a profound difference between the two. Belief asks you to accept, to submit, to close the door on further inquiry. Thinking asks you to examine, to test, to remain open to wherever evidence and logic may lead. You were born with a mind capable of extraordinary reasoning, yet you have been taught to distrust that very capacity when it comes to matters deemed sacred. Why? Who benefits from your intellectual submission? Certainly not you. Let us begin with the most fundamental question. Where is the evidence? Not the evidence of faith, not the evidence of personal experience, not the evidence of what you feel in your heart, but the evidence that would satisfy any reasonable standard of historical verification. When historians examine figures from antiquity, they look for contemporary accounts, for multiple independent sources, for archaeological evidence, for documentation that can be cross-referenced and verified. By these standards, figures far less celebrated than Jesus have substantial historical support. Yet when we search for Jesus of Nazareth using these same rigorous methods, we find something unexpected: silence. The supposed life of Jesus occurred during a period of Roman history that was relatively well documented. The Romans were meticulous record keepers. They documented rebellions, executed criminals, tracked populations, recorded trials, and maintained extensive archives of events throughout their empire. Palestine was under Roman occupation during the time Jesus allegedly lived, and any figure who attracted crowds, challenged religious authorities, caused disturbances in temples, or was executed as a political criminal would have warranted documentation. Yet in all the Roman records from this period, there is no mention of Jesus Christ. None. Not in the writings of local governors, not in the records of Pontius Pilate, not in any contemporary Roman account. But perhaps the Romans simply missed him. Perhaps he was too insignificant for their notice, despite the gospel claims of crowds following him, despite the supposed sensation of his trial, despite the alleged earthquake and darkness that accompanied his death. If we cannot find Jesus in Roman records, surely we can find him in Jewish sources from the same period. After all, according to the narrative, Jesus was causing considerable trouble for Jewish religious authorities, teaching in synagogues, debating with Pharisees, and attracting followers who believed he was the Messiah. The Jewish community was literate, scholarly, and deeply concerned with religious matters. They kept extensive records and writings. Surely they would have mentioned this controversial figure. Yet when we examine Jewish writings from the 1st century, we again find silence. The historian Josephus, who wrote extensively about Jewish affairs during this exact period, makes only 2 brief mentions of Jesus in his works, and the longer of these passages, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is widely recognized by scholars as a later Christian interpolation. The language, the style, the content all indicate that this passage was inserted by Christian scribes centuries after Josephus wrote his histories. The shorter reference merely mentions James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, a passing reference that tells us nothing about Jesus himself except that some people called him Christ. This is hardly the kind of documentation we would expect for a figure who supposedly drew massive crowds, performed public miracles, and caused enough disturbance to warrant execution. Think about what this means. We have extensive writings from this period about minor political figures, local religious teachers, small rebel leaders, and various others who left far less impact than Jesus supposedly did. We have detailed accounts of other messianic claimants who attracted far fewer followers. Yet for the man who Christians claim was the Son of God, who performed miracles witnessed by thousands, who rose from the dead and appeared to hundreds, we have virtually no contemporary documentation. Does this not strike you as odd? Does this not warrant investigation rather than immediate dismissal? The earliest writings about Jesus that we possess are the letters of Paul, written approximately 20 years after Jesus supposedly died. But here we encounter another problem that undermines the historical Jesus narrative. Paul, despite writing extensively about Christ, shows remarkably little interest in the historical Jesus. He rarely quotes Jesus directly. He provides almost no biographical details about Jesus' life. He does not mention the virgin birth, does not describe any specific miracles, does not reference the teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, and does not provide details about the trial or crucifixion beyond the bare fact that Jesus was crucified. For someone writing about a man he never met but who supposedly lived just 2 decades earlier, Paul is strangely silent about the details of Jesus' earthly existence. What Paul does discuss is a mystical, spiritual Christ, a cosmic figure who exists in a supernatural realm. Paul's Christ is revealed through visions and scripture interpretation, not through eyewitness testimony of a recent historical figure. This is the language of mystery religion, of mythological thinking, not the language of someone describing a real person whose deeds were known to living witnesses. If Jesus had really performed the miracles described in the Gospels, if he had really drawn crowds of thousands, if he had really made the impact claimed in the later Gospel narratives, would Paul not have mentioned these things? Would he not have referenced specific teachings, specific miracles, specific events that people could verify? The Gospels themselves, written 40 to 70 years after the supposed events they describe, present their own set of logical problems. They are not eyewitness accounts. None of them were written by the people whose names they bear. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest, was written around 70 CE, a full 40 years after Jesus supposedly died. Matthew and Luke were written later still, copying extensively from Mark and adding their own embellishments. John was written last, perhaps 60 to 70 years after the supposed events, and presents a Jesus so different from the synoptic Gospels that scholars have long puzzled over how to reconcile them. Consider what 40 to 70 years means in terms of historical reliability. If someone today tried to write a detailed account of events from the 1950s or 1960s based entirely on oral tradition, without any written records or photographs or surviving eyewitnesses, how accurate would that account be? Would it contain the kind of specific dialogue, detailed descriptions, and precise sequences that we find in the Gospels? Or would it be filled with legendary embellishment, theological interpretation, and mythological elements that accumulated over decades of retelling? The Gospels themselves reveal this process of legendary development. Mark, the earliest Gospel, contains no virgin birth, no genealogy tracing Jesus back to David, a relatively simple crucifixion narrative, and an original ending where the women find the empty tomb and tell no one. By the time we get to Matthew and Luke, written 15 to 20 years later, Suddenly we have elaborate birth narratives with angels and star and wise men and shepherds, though Matthew and Luke cannot even agree on the basic details of these stories. We have genealogies that trace Jesus back to David, though the two genealogies contradict each other completely. We have expanded resurrection appearances. By the time we reach John, written perhaps 30 years after Mark, Jesus has become fully divine from the beginning, speaks in long philosophical monologues, unlike anything in the earlier Gospels, and performs different miracles in a different chronological sequence. This is exactly what we would expect from legendary development, not from historical reporting. Each successive Gospel adds more miraculous elements, more theological sophistication, more dramatic detail. If these were truly independent eyewitness accounts, we would expect the opposite pattern. The earliest accounts would be the most detailed and vivid, written when memories were fresh, while later accounts would lose detail. Instead, we see the classic pattern of myth formation, where stories grow more elaborate with each retelling, where theological concerns shape the narrative more than historical accuracy, where the needs of the community creating the story determine what gets included and emphasized. The contradictions within and between the Gospels further undermine their historical reliability. Consider the crucifixion narratives. Who went to the tomb? How many women? What did they find there? Whom did they see? What were they told? What did they do afterward? Read the four Gospel accounts carefully and you will find that they cannot be reconciled. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb and found a young man who told them Jesus had risen, and they fled in fear and told no one. Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went. There was an earthquake, an angel descended. The guards fainted. The angel told the women Jesus had risen, and Jesus himself appeared to them. Luke says the women went to the tomb, found it empty. Two men in shining garments appeared. The women told the apostles who did not believe them, and Peter ran to check. John says Mary Magdalene went alone, found the tomb empty, ran to tell Peter and John. They came and saw, then left, and Mary saw two angels, and then Jesus himself. These are not minor variations in detail. These are fundamentally different accounts of what supposedly happened. Apologists will attempt to harmonize these accounts, creating elaborate explanations for how all four could somehow be true simultaneously. But such harmonization requires adding information not present in the texts and making assumptions that strain credibility. The simpler explanation, the explanation that fits the evidence better, is that these are different versions of a developing legend, each shaped by the theological concerns and narrative needs of the community that produced it. The historical problems extend beyond the Gospels themselves to the very foundations of Christian claims. Consider the claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Both Matthew and Luke place his birth there, but they give completely different and mutually contradictory reasons for why Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem. Matthew implies they lived there, fled to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre of infants, and only later moved to Nazareth. Luke has them living in Nazareth, traveling to Bethlehem for a census, giving birth there, and returning to Nazareth. These stories cannot both be true. Moreover, Luke's census story is historically impossible. There was no empire-wide census under Quirinius that required people to return to their ancestral homes, and the census that Quirinius did conduct occurred in 6 CE, 10 years after Herod died. Luke has confused dates, invented circumstances, and created an entire narrative to fulfill the prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Why would the Gospel authors need to place Jesus' birth in Bethlehem? Because the Hebrew Scriptures prophesied that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, the city of David. If Jesus was actually from Nazareth, as seems most likely given that he is consistently called Jesus of Nazareth and his followers were known to be from Galilee, then the Gospel writers faced a problem. How could Jesus be the Messiah if he was not from Bethlehem? Their solution was to create birth narratives that got Jesus to Bethlehem, even though their stories contradict each other and contain historical impossibilities. This is evidence of theological construction, not historical reporting. The same pattern appears throughout the Gospel narratives. Events are shaped to fulfill prophecy, not because they happened, but because the Gospel writers needed them to happen to support their theological claims. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey because Zechariah prophesied the king would come riding on a donkey. Jesus is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver because of a supposed prophecy in Zechariah. Jesus' bones are not broken on the cross to fulfill a psalm. The problem is that many of these supposed prophecies were never messianic prophecies in their original context. The Gospel writers went through Hebrew scriptures looking for passages they could reinterpret as referring to Jesus, often taking verses completely out of context and giving them meanings they never had. Consider Isaiah 7:14, the supposed prophecy of the virgin birth. In its original context, this verse is not a prophecy about a Messiah who will be born 700 years in the future. Isaiah is speaking to King Ahaz about a sign concerning the immediate political crisis Judah faces. The Hebrew word translated as virgin, Alma, simply means young woman, not virgin. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, used the word parthenos, which can mean virgin, and this mistranslation gave rise to the virgin birth tradition. But in the original Hebrew context, Isaiah is saying that a young woman, probably Ahaz's wife, will have a child, and before that child grows up, the threat from the two kings will be gone. This has nothing to do with a future Messiah born of a virgin. Yet the Gospel writers took this verse, stripped it from its context, mistranslated it, and used it to support their narrative about Jesus. This reveals something crucial about how the Jesus story developed. It was not that a historical Jesus did things that happened to fulfill prophecies. Rather, the Gospel writers searched scriptures for passages they could reinterpret as prophecies, then created narratives about Jesus that fulfilled these reinterpreted passages. They were constructing a theological argument, not recording history. Every major element of the Jesus story, the virgin birth, the betrayal, the crucifixion details, the resurrection, can be traced to Hebrew scriptures that the Gospel writers mined for material to construct their narrative. But perhaps the most logically devastating problem with the Jesus narrative is the resurrection itself. This is the central claim of Christianity. Without the resurrection, as Paul himself admitted, the entire faith collapses. Yet when we examine the resurrection claims with even minimal logical scrutiny, they dissolve into incoherence. The Gospel accounts cannot agree on basic facts. Who went to the tomb? What did they find? Whom did they see? What happened next? As we have seen, the four Gospels give contradictory answers to all these questions. But beyond the contradictions, there is a more fundamental problem. The resurrection claim requires us to believe that a man who was executed, certified dead and buried, came back to life 3 days later. This would be, if true, the most extraordinary event in human history, a violation of every natural law we understand, an event so remarkable that it would require the most extraordinary evidence to be credible. What evidence do we have? We have contradictory accounts written 40 to 70 years after the supposed event by people who were not eyewitnesses, accounts that cannot agree on basic details, accounts that show clear signs of legendary development. We have Paul's claim that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people, but we have no names, no testimonies from any of these people, no way to verify this claim. We have a tomb that was supposedly empty, but we have no independent verification that Jesus was buried in that specific tomb, no contemporary documentation of the burial location, no way to verify any of these claims. Think about what we would require to believe such an extraordinary claim if it were made today. If someone claimed that a person who had been executed and buried 3 days ago had come back to life, what would we need to believe it? We would need multiple independent eyewitness testimonies. We would need medical documentation of the death and the return to life. We would need physical evidence. We would need the person themselves to appear publicly and demonstrate their return to life in verifiable ways. We would never accept such a claim based solely on contradictory stories written decades later by people who were not there. Yet this is exactly what Christian tradition asks us to accept regarding Jesus. Moreover, the resurrection stories contain internal elements that undermine their credibility. In Matthew, to prevent the disciples from stealing the body, Pilate supposedly posts guards at the tomb and seals it. When the resurrection occurs, there is an earthquake. An angel descends, the stone rolls away, and the guards faint. Later, the chief priests bribe the guards to say the disciples stole the body while they slept. But consider the logical problems here. If the guards were asleep, How would they know the disciples stole the body? If they were awake, why would they admit to sleeping on duty, which was a capital offense? Why would the Jewish authorities need to bribe guards who had just witnessed an angel and an earthquake? Why is this entire story only in Matthew, and not in any other gospel or any other source? The answer is that Matthew invented this story to counter the apparently already circulating accusation that the disciples stole the body. It is apologetics, not history. The appearance stories likewise contain problematic elements. In some accounts, Jesus appears in bodily form, eats food, invites Thomas to touch his wounds. In others, he appears and disappears mysteriously, walks through walls, is not recognized by his own disciples until he reveals himself. These are the characteristics of a spirit or vision, not a physical resurrection. The accounts cannot decide whether Jesus was supposed to be physically resurrected in his actual body, or whether his appearances were visionary experiences. This confusion makes sense if we understand the resurrection as a developing theological concept rather than a historical event. Early believers had visionary experiences that they interpreted as encounters with a risen Christ. As the tradition developed, these visionary experiences became literalized into physical resurrection appearances. But the tension between the spiritual and physical remains visible in the conflicting accounts. The logical problems multiply when we consider what the resurrection was supposedly for. According to Christian theology, Jesus died as a sacrifice for human sin, rose from the dead to demonstrate his power over death, and ascended to heaven where he reigns until his return. But why would any of this be necessary? If God is omnipotent, why would he need to sacrifice his Son to forgive human sins? Why could he not simply forgive sins without requiring blood sacrifice? The entire theological framework rests on ancient Near Eastern concepts of sacrifice and propitiation that made sense in primitive religious contexts but dissolve under logical analysis. An omnipotent, perfectly good God would not require the torture and execution of an innocent person to forgive others. This is not justice. This is not mercy. This is barbarism dressed in theological language. Furthermore, if the purpose of Jesus' resurrection was to demonstrate his divine nature and power over death, why did he not appear publicly to those who executed him, to the Roman authorities, to the crowds in Jerusalem, to anyone beyond his own followers? Why appear only to a small group of believers in circumstances that could easily be explained as visionary experiences or grief hallucinations? If you wanted to prove you had conquered death, would you not appear publicly, undeniably, in ways that could not be questioned? Instead, we have appearance stories that are private, ambiguous, and subject to multiple interpretations. The entire structure of Christian theology rests on claims that cannot be verified, on events that show all the marks of legendary development, on a foundation of contradictory narratives that cannot be reconciled with each other or with known history. Yet billions of people accept these claims as absolute truth, structure their lives around them, judge others based on them, and in many cases attempt to enforce these beliefs on entire societies through law and custom. Why? Not because the evidence compels belief, not because the logic is sound, not because the claims can withstand scrutiny, but because they were taught these things from childhood, because their communities reinforce these beliefs, because questioning them carries social costs, and because the alternative, accepting that these foundational beliefs might be false, is too psychologically threatening to contemplate. This is the power of inherited belief systems. They create self-reinforcing structures that make questioning extremely difficult. If you grow up being told that these stories are literally true, that faith is a virtue, that doubt is sin, that questioning leads to eternal punishment, then the psychological barriers to examining these claims rationally become nearly insurmountable. Your entire identity, your community relationships, your understanding of reality itself may be bound up with these beliefs. To question them is to risk everything. Yet this is precisely why the question must be asked. Any belief system that punishes doubt, that discourages investigation, that makes questioning itself a moral failing, is a system of control, not a system of truth. Truth does not fear investigation. Truth does not need to be protected by threats. Truth does not demand that you stop thinking. If the claims about Jesus were true, they would be strengthened by examination, not threatened by it. The fact that religious authorities throughout history have so strenuously opposed critical examination of these claims, have suppressed dissent, have punished doubt, suggests they understand at some level that these claims cannot withstand scrutiny. If you have truth on your side, you welcome investigation. If you have power based on false claims, you suppress investigation. Consider also how the Jesus narrative has been used throughout history. It has been used to justify crusades, inquisitions, conquests, slavery, and countless other atrocities. It has been used to suppress women, to persecute those who love differently, to justify inequality, to maintain hierarchies of power. The claim that one must believe in Jesus to avoid eternal torture has been wielded as a weapon of psychological terror, particularly against children who are taught from their earliest years that failure to believe correctly will result in infinite punishment. This is not love. This is not good news. This is a system of control that uses fear to maintain compliance and suppress independent thought. Moreover, the Jesus narrative promotes a fundamentally unhealthy relationship with reality. It teaches that this life is merely preparation for the next, that suffering here is acceptable because reward awaits elsewhere, that faith without evidence is noble, that obedience is more important than understanding, that an ancient text contains all the answers you need, and independent investigation is unnecessary or dangerous. These teachings undermine human capacity for reason, for ethical development based on actual consequences, for taking full responsibility for our lives and our world. They create passive acceptance of injustice, since justice will supposedly be served in an afterlife. They discourage scientific investigation when it conflicts with dogma. They fragment communities into believers and non-believers, saved and damned, chosen and rejected. The alternative is not nihilism or despair. The alternative is liberation through reason. When you release yourself from the obligation to believe claims that have no solid foundation, you free your mind to think clearly about what actually is, rather than what you have been told must be. When you recognize that moral behavior does not require divine commands or threats of eternal punishment, you can develop ethics based on genuine concern for human well-being and actual consequences. When you accept that this life is the one you can be certain of, you take it more seriously, rather than treating it as a waiting room for something better. When you embrace doubt as a tool for finding truth, rather than fearing it as a sin, you open yourself to genuine understanding rather than remaining trapped in inherited certainty. None of this requires certainty that Jesus did not exist. The point is not to make a counterclaim that must be believed on faith. The point is to demonstrate that the claims made about Jesus cannot be sustained by evidence and logic, that the foundations of Christian belief rest on sand, that what billions accept as absolute truth is actually a collection of contradictory narratives, legendary embellishments, theological constructions, and historical impossibilities. Whether a historical preacher named Jesus existed and was later mythologized, or whether the entire figure was invented from the start, the Jesus of Christian doctrine, the divine Son of God who performed miracles and rose from the dead, cannot be sustained by rational examination. This should matter to you regardless of whether you currently believe. If you are a believer, you should want your beliefs to be true, to be based on solid ground, to be defensible through reason rather than required through faith. If examining your beliefs reveals they cannot withstand scrutiny, this is valuable information, not a threat. It means you have the opportunity to align your understanding with reality rather than remaining bound to inherited falsehoods. If you are already a skeptic, understanding the logical and historical problems with Christian claims equips you to engage with those claims more effectively and to help others who may be questioning. The path forward is not to replace one dogma with another. It is not to become certain that you know all the answers. It is to develop intellectual honesty, to follow evidence wherever it leads, to embrace uncertainty when certainty is not warranted, to build your understanding on demonstrable facts rather than inherited claims, to recognize that saying "I do not know" is often more honest than claiming certainty without justification. This is the foundation of genuine wisdom, not the pretended certainty of faith. You have been given a remarkable tool in your capacity for reason. You have the ability to examine claims, to weigh evidence, to recognize logical flaws, to distinguish between what is demonstrated and what is merely asserted. When you apply this capacity to the claims about Jesus, when you look past the authority of tradition and the pressure of inherited belief, when you examine the evidence as you would examine any other historical claim, you find that the foundation crumbles. This is not a failure. This is clarity. This is liberation from the obligation to believe what cannot be sustained by reason. The question before you now is whether you have the courage to follow your inquiry wherever it leads, even if it leads away from what you were taught, even if it costs you the comfort of inherited certainty, even if it requires you to stand apart from the beliefs of your community. This is not easy, but it is necessary if you value truth over comfort, if you value understanding over obedience, if you value your own capacity for thought over the dictates of ancient authority. What you have read here are not attacks, but invitations. Invitations to examine, to question, to think for yourself rather than accept what you have been told. The claims about Jesus have shaped civilizations, but that does not make them true. Billions believe them, but that does not make them rational. They have ancient roots, but that does not make them valid. When you strip away the authority of tradition, the pressure of community, the comfort of inherited belief, and examine these claims by the standards you would apply to any other historical or logical proposition, they cannot stand. This is not the end of meaning or purpose or ethics. It is the beginning of honest engagement with reality as it actually is, rather than as you have been told it must be. It is the opportunity to build your understanding on solid ground, rather than on the shifting sands of faith. It is the liberation of your mind from obligations that cannot be justified, and the full deployment of your capacity for reason in pursuit of genuine understanding. You were born with the ability to think, to question, to examine, to reason. Use it. Do not let fear of what you might discover prevent you from investigating what you have been taught to accept without question. Do not let the comfort of certainty blind you to the weakness of the foundation on which that certainty rests. Do not let the pressure of tradition or community prevent you from thinking for yourself. This is your mind, your life, your one certain existence. You owe it to yourself to understand it based on what can actually be known, rather than what you have been told you must believe. The logical dissolution of sacred certainty is not an ending. It is a beginning. It is the first step toward intellectual freedom, toward honest engagement with reality, toward building your understanding on demonstration rather than decree. This is the path that Spinoza walked centuries ago, and it remains the path of reason today. Not comfortable but true, not easy but necessary, not certain of all answers but honest about what can and cannot be known. Now the question is yours. Will you continue to accept what you have been taught because it is familiar and comfortable? Or will you have the courage to examine it with the same rational scrutiny you would apply to any other claim? Will you fear doubt, or will you embrace it as the beginning of genuine understanding? Will you submit your mind to ancient authority, or will you claim your right to think for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you agree, where you disagree, where you find yourself questioning what you once accepted without examination. Subscribe to continue these conversations, to explore ideas that challenge inherited certainty, to build understanding based on reason rather than faith. This is not the last word on these questions. It is an invitation to begin asking them honestly, without fear of where the answers might lead. That is the beginning of wisdom. That is the path of reason.